Let's get something straight right now. This is not about playing games. This is about flipping the emotional script in a relationship where avoidant patterns have made you feel like you're always the one proving your worth. One of the most profound psychological shifts that changes how an avoidant sees you is detachment from the outcome. This isn't about pretending not to care. It's about truly releasing the emotional grip you've had on what they do, say, or choose. It's about stepping out of the emotional dependency that makes you reactive to every breadcrumb of attention or distance they give you. And this shift doesn't just empower you. It rewires the entire power dynamic between you and the avoidant. Here's why this matters. Avoidant individuals are hypersensitive to emotional pressure. The more emotionally invested you are in the outcome, whether it's getting them to commit, reply, or open up, the more they feel that pressure, even if it's unspoken. That pressure triggers their defense mechanisms. They may pull away, ghost, or become cold. Not necessarily because they don't care, but because they feel a loss of control and autonomy. But the moment you let go of that outcome, the moment you stop trying to control how they respond, is the moment you change the energy of the dynamic. When you're no longer anxiously waiting for a reply, no longer adjusting yourself, worth based on their behavior, something powerful happens. Your presence becomes lighter, less emotionally charged. And for an avoidant, that shift is not only noticeable, it's magnetic. When you detach, you stop playing the game of emotional chasing. You remove yourself from the power imbalance that avoidants unconsciously create by withholding affection or communication. Your energy stops saying, "I need you to choose me to feel okay." It starts saying, "I'm okay either way." That's a whole different message. And they feel it, even if you don't say a word. Detachment doesn't mean coldness or shutting down emotionally. It means operating from self, trust instead of fear. It's trusting that you're worthy, whether they recognize it or not. It's trusting that you don't need to prove your value to be loved. When you start showing up with that internal security, avoidants begin to experience a form of emotional safety around you. Because you're not trying to fix or change them. You're not trying to rush the connection. You're simply being grounded and present without demanding more than they can offer. This shift also creates space for the avoidant to experience their own feelings without you constantly filling the silence or compensating for their emotional gaps. In that space, they begin to notice the contrast between your emotional stability and their own discomfort. And instead of running from that discomfort, they start questioning it. That's when interest starts to turn into desire, not for your attention, but for your presence, your energy, your strength. Ultimately, detachment from outcome is one of the most powerful things you can do, not just to attract an avoidant, but to honor yourself. It puts you in a position where your value no longer hinges on someone else's recognition. And ironically, that's when they finally start to see your worth. Because you've stopped needing them to. When you shift your energy from chasing someone else to showing up for yourself, everything changes, especially in the dynamic with an avoidant partner. Avoidants are hypersensitive to emotional pressure and expectation. The more you orbit around their emotional availability, the more they feel cornered. But the moment you begin prioritizing your own growth, healing, and joy, it creates a shift in the energetic balance that is both noticeable and powerful. It's no longer about proving your worth to them. It's about reclaiming it for yourself. And that's magnetic. Self-priority doesn't mean closing off or becoming selfish. It means making a conscious choice to stop waiting for them to validate your value. It's choosing to live, not pause. When you stop structuring your decisions around how they might feel or react, you create space for your own needs, your own passions, and your own peace to come back online. That internal shift sends a silent but potent message. I am not here to earn love. I am love. Avoidants, by their nature, feel safest when they have emotional distance. They're not wired to trust quickly or attach easily. So when you were overextending, overgiving, or constantly checking in, they interpreted that intensity as pressure. But when you redirect that energy inward, when your time, attention, and emotional investment go toward yourself, it signals to them that you are no longer dependent on their availability. That shift doesn't go unnoticed. It triggers something inside them: curiosity. Why? Because your self-prioritization disrupts the emotional script they've grown used to. You're no longer playing the role of the pursuer. You're no longer managing their emotional temperature. That absence of pursuit leaves space for them to feel your value without you having to push it onto them. And ironically, that's often when they begin to feel the pull. Because now you're not seeking their validation, you're living in your own worth. There's another layer to this. When you prioritize yourself, your energy changes. You start moving with more confidence, more clarity. Your boundaries become cleaner. Your joy becomes less conditional. And this emotional sovereignty isn't just attractive. It's rare. Avoidants aren't used to people who love them without losing themselves. So when they see you thriving on your own, they begin to reassess the dynamic. Not because you demanded it, but because your growth made them feel the contrast. They may not say it out loud. They may not immediately come forward. But that energetic shift plants a seed. It makes them question the narrative that intimacy always equals loss of self. It shows them a different model of connection. One where love isn't about sacrifice, but about alignment. The truth is, your power doesn't come from what you do to win them back. It comes from how fully you choose to show up for yourself. That's what turns the dynamic around. That's what shifts their perception. And most importantly, that's what sets you free, regardless of how they respond. Because the moment you choose you, everything else starts aligning, including the way they begin to see you. One of the most underestimated psychological shifts in a relationship with an avoidant is the power of non-reactivity. When you stop emotionally reacting to their silence, their coldness, or their push-pull patterns, you take the fuel out of the dynamic they unconsciously rely on. Avoidants often operate through a cycle of control, not overt control, but emotional control. They pull back to manage their own discomfort with closeness. They distance themselves when things get intense. And typically, when they do this, they expect a reaction: panic, pleading, pursuit. That reaction reassures them that they still hold emotional power. It reinforces their internal narrative that closeness equals threat and distance equals safety. But when you stop reacting, everything changes. You break that emotional loop. You no longer reinforce their fear of intimacy by proving it right. And in doing so, you force them into a space they're not used to: reflection. Non-reactivity isn't about ignoring someone or pretending you're unaffected. It's about emotional self-regulation. It's choosing to respond, not react. It's pausing instead of spiraling. It's not sending 5 texts in a row just because they went silent. It's holding your ground when they test your boundaries, instead of collapsing into fear of abandonment. And here's the critical piece. When you remain grounded in your emotional energy, it exposes theirs. Avoidants are masters at emotional projection. When they feel overwhelmed or insecure, they shift the blame. They subtly make you feel like you're too much, too needy, or too emotional. But when you stay calm, collected, and clear, there's nothing for them to deflect onto. The mirror is suddenly turned inward. They're left to face the discomfort they've been avoiding. This internal disruption doesn't feel good to them, but it's necessary. Because now, instead of hiding behind your reaction, they're forced to examine their own behavior. The silence they once used to feel in control now becomes a space where they feel their own inconsistency, their fear, their unresolved wounds. And that discomfort is what starts to create a shift in awareness. Non-reactivity also reclaims your power. It sends a loud message without a single word. I will not lose myself trying to manage your inability to show up. That clarity is grounding. It gives you space to stay connected to your own values instead of getting swept up in their emotional turbulence. And ironically, that's when avoidants often start to take notice. They may not show it right away, but underneath the surface, they feel the change. They feel the gap between your emotional steadiness and their emotional avoidance. That contrast becomes undeniable, and in time, that's what starts to dismantle their control. Not because you fought for it, but because you stopped playing the role they needed to maintain it. True strength in these dynamics isn't in how loud you get. It's in how silent you can be while staying grounded in your truth. Non-reactivity is not passive. It's powerful. It's a form of self-respect that forces the avoidant to finally meet themselves. Silence is not just the absence of words. It's the disruption of expectation. And for the avoidant, silence from you doesn't just feel like distance. It feels like something is missing from the emotional script they're used to. Avoidants often thrive in predictable emotional loops. You reach, they pull back, you explain, they withdraw, you chase, they run. This rhythm gives them a sense of control, even if it's dysfunctional. It allows them to feel emotionally safe while keeping intimacy at bay. But when you go silent, truly silent without reaction, explanation, or emotional pursuit, you disrupt the entire pattern they rely on. This disruption is jarring for someone with an avoidant attachment style. They're used to the emotional dance continuing even after conflict or distance. They expect you to fill in the gaps with effort, reassurance, or apologies. When you don't, it forces them out of autopilot. The space you create becomes a break in the loop, a pause that forces them to confront what's been happening beneath the surface. In that silence, they are met with something unfamiliar themselves. Not your words, not your energy, not your emotions, but their own. And for someone who has spent most of their relational life avoiding vulnerability, that internal reflection can be both uncomfortable and transformative. Suddenly, they don't have your emotional responses to distract them from their own fears, projections, or unresolved pain. Avoidants often rationalize their behavior with narratives like, they were too much, or I just needed space, or they didn't respect my boundaries. But silence removes the opportunity for blame. When there's no pushback, no pleas, no emotional pressure from you, it becomes harder for them to cling to that storyline. Instead, they're left with a haunting question. Why do I feel off when they're no longer trying? This is where psychological tension begins to build. The silence acts as a mirror, reflecting back the emotional absence they've created. It creates contrast between your consistent presence in the past and the stillness now. That contrast doesn't scream. It whispers. It says, something has changed. And it pulls their attention not toward you in a desperate way, but toward themselves in an introspective way. Silence also signals growth. It says, I no longer participate in dynamics that drain me. It's not punishment, it's clarity. It repositions you as someone who respects yourself enough not to beg for crumbs. And that changes the entire power structure of the relationship. Because now you're not reacting. You're not over-explaining. You're simply gone from the emotional battlefield they're used to winning. This unfamiliar shift triggers reflection. Did I misjudge their value? Was I actually safer in that connection than I realized? Why does their absence feel heavier than their presence ever did? Those are the kinds of questions silence stirs in an avoidant's mind. Ultimately, silence isn't about creating fear of loss. It's about ending the cycle that was never sustainable in the first place. And when you stop showing up in the ways they once depended on, it becomes impossible for them to keep running from the truth. The dynamic is broken, and something in them has to change if they want it back. Consistency without clinginess is one of the most powerful and disarming behaviors you can show when dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style. Avoidants are wired to anticipate emotional pressure. They expect that love will come at the cost of their autonomy, that intimacy will demand too much from them, and that connection will eventually feel suffocating. So when someone shows up consistently, but not clingily, it disrupts that entire belief system. It creates an experience they don't know how to categorize because it's not what they're used to. And in that unfamiliar experience, trust begins to form. Most avoidants associate closeness with loss of space. So they naturally put up walls, retreat, or shut down when someone gets too emotionally expressive or overly available. But when you show them you can care without chasing, be present without pushing, and love without losing yourself, you confuse the mental script they've been following their whole lives. You're not playing the role of the anxious pursuer. You're showing up in your own lane, steady, grounded, and self-respecting. This kind of consistency isn't about showing up for them at your own expense. It's about staying in alignment with your values. It's texting when you want to, not because you're afraid they'll pull away. It's saying how you feel, not to manipulate, but to express yourself clearly. And it's setting boundaries, not to create distance, but to protect your emotional well-being. When you behave in this way, the avoidant doesn't feel trapped. They feel safe. Safe in the sense that they're not being emotionally ambushed. Safe in knowing that your presence doesn't come with an unspoken contract of obligation. And that's exactly what starts to soften their defenses. Because underneath the fear of intimacy, avoidants do crave connection. They just don't trust it will be healthy. Consistency without clinginess is slow building. It's subtle, and it often goes unappreciated in the beginning, but it sinks in. It leaves an impression. It becomes the calm contrast to the chaotic push-pull relationships they've known before. And while they may not immediately react with gratitude or openness, their nervous system starts to relax around you. That's the first step toward trust. But here's the key. You have to maintain your boundaries while being consistent. If you drop your needs the moment, they get distant. Or if you start over accommodating their fear, you reinforce their belief that closeness always requires sacrifice. Instead, when you hold your emotional line while still showing care, they see that it's possible to be close to someone without being consumed. In time, that consistency breaks down their walls. Not through force, but through repetition, through showing up as someone who is emotionally available and self-respecting. That duality is what builds trust, not just in you, but in the very idea that love doesn't have to come with pressure, chaos, or fear. So remember, you don't need to chase them. You don't need to fix them. You just need to be who you are, consistently, clearly, and without losing yourself. That's how emotional safety is created. And with avoidance, emotional safety is everything. Confidence isn't just attractive. It's disruptive, especially to someone with an avoidant attachment style. When an avoidant sees you thriving without needing their approval, affection, or validation, it quietly but powerfully destabilizes their emotional worldview. Why? Because avoidants are often drawn to dynamics where they feel a sense of control or distance. They're used to people proving their worth, chasing connection, or over-accommodating just to be close to them. But when you start thriving on your own without looking back, you become the emotional contrast they didn't expect. And that contrast becomes a trigger. Your confidence represents everything they tried to convince themselves you didn't have without them: peace, power, and purpose. And when you live in that energy, not perform it, but embody it, you create a psychological rupture in their narrative. That narrative might have said, "They'll fall apart without me," or "They need me more than I need them," or "I was right to walk away." But now they're watching you glow in your independence, and it doesn't align with the mental story they told themselves to justify their distance. Avoidants tend to compartmentalize their emotions. They push down feelings they don't want to face, and they convince themselves that disconnection is safer than vulnerability. But when you detach, not as a reaction, but as a lifestyle shift rooted in self-worth. They can no longer escape the realization that you were never the problem. Their emotional choices start to come into question. Did I misjudge them? Why does their absence feel more powerful than their presence ever did? That internal dissonance is the beginning of reflection. It's when they start remembering moments when you showed up for them without asking for anything in return. It's when they realize that your love wasn't needy. It was consistent. It's when they begin to recognize that the person they emotionally distanced from was the very person who created a space of emotional safety. Your confidence puts a spotlight on their emotional avoidance, but it forces them to see how they pushed away something that could have been deeply fulfilling. It's not your silence alone that shifts things. It's the fact that you're not waiting around and you're still rising. That hits different, because they weren't prepared for you to thrive without them. Confidence is not loud. It doesn't chase. It doesn't explain. It simply is. It shows up in how you walk into a room, how you set boundaries, how you protect your peace, and how you choose to invest in people who reciprocate. It's magnetic because it's rooted in truth, not in reaction. And here's what matters. When your confidence becomes the trigger, it opens the door for accountability. But only if they're ready. You can't force the realization, but you can create the conditions for it. And thriving without needing their validation is one of the most powerful ways to do it. Because when you no longer seek their attention, they begin to question why they ever had it. That's the power shift. That's when the avoidant starts looking back. Not because you asked them to, but because your confidence made them realize what they lost. So let me wrap this up with one truth. Avoidants don't wake up and change because you asked them to. They shift when you shift. Your behavior becomes the mirror. Your detachment becomes the reset. Your silence becomes the spark. The moment you start choosing you, they start seeing you differently. Not as someone to avoid, but someone they could lose. And that's when the real power kicks in. You don't need to chase them. You need to become someone it hurts to lose. And that starts with every psychological shift you make from needing their validation to standing fully in your own.